Hey folks, welcome to the Rain channel. And today we're hitting on a topic that these two gentlemen often get questioned on. They're the two Georges, but we're going to call them GST George, which is George Tadros. And of course,
Yep.
our good friend and long-term trusted partner with BDO as well is George Doobie. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we're going to get right to work. Now, what we are looking at when it comes to short-term rentals and Airbnb is the tax consequences. So if we go to GST George, the note I've got here is if Airbnb, for example, is remitting GST, HST on our behalf, do we need to do anything else? So that question seems a little vague. Can you dial it in a little bit, give us a little bit more information on what the answer to that question might be?
Absolutely. And I just want to start by saying there's this false notion that Airbnb collects GST on behalf of property owners and remits GST on behalf of property owners. They're required under new legislation to collect and remit tax as a digital accommodation platform. That is Airbnb's liability. That is tax where a property is held by someone who is not registered for GST. So a lot of property owners that have properties in short-term rental pools assume that they are off the hook for any GST obligations. And the reality is that's not true. There could be a number of reasons why they may have a GST obligation. The first is they might already be registered for GST.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, Airbnb should be notified of their GST number. And Airbnb is never going to collect and remit tax on your behalf. Airbnb will collect tax and provide you with that tax in order for you to remit it on your next GST return. A second area where people might fall short of the obligations is they might become a registrant. And I think when you hear of the word registrant, you're thinking somebody who's registered for GST, but that's not necessarily the case. It's someone who is registered for GST or should be registered for GST. So there's a $30,000 threshold for all taxable sales for an entity, and that includes short-term accommodations. If you ever hit that threshold, you are now a registrant, whether you're registered for GST or not, and you have an obligation to collect and remit the tax. So once again, you'll have to collect and remit that tax, and you'd have to notify Airbnb. There are some consequences of not notifying Airbnb when you are registered for tax or should be registered for tax. The first is that the tax that Airbnb is collecting on your short-term rentals does not change your obligations to have to collect tax. So even though Airbnb is collecting on the weekend getaways and any other short-term tenancy, um, CRA that doesn't change CRA's mind in terms of whether or not you, as a property owner that's renting that property through Airbnb, has an obligation to collect and remit GST. So that is something we always tell folks to watch out for. Airbnb is collecting tax for themselves. It just happens that they collect tax for themselves where a property owner is not registered and doesn't have to be registered to collect the tax.
So
Maybe, sorry, Patrick. Maybe, George, could you also comment? So I'll receive comments from or questions from a lot of clients regarding that 30,000, and they're thinking it's just for that property as compared to all of their other activities or associated activities. Maybe you just comment on that quickly.
mm,
Yeah, so that $30,000 threshold relates to any entity. Now, I should qualify any person for GST purposes. That could include an individual. So if I'm, an individual that's got $20,000 of, let's say, photography sales as an individual, I'm considered that same individual as somebody who might own some Airbnb properties.
mm.
And so if I hit $12,000 in the same year that I hit $20,000 of photography revenue, well, I'm now over that $30,000 threshold. And now I'm a registrant. And so I do have to register for GST. I'd have to notify Airbnb, give them my GST number so that they collect the tax for me and not collect the tax for their obligations.
So just for clarity, though, when you say that, and I get that, but as an individual, so I'm going to just add another layer of question, which is if if I've got a couple of corporations and, one is my Airbnb and I run all of my short-term rentals Airbnb through that corporation, and I have the photography studio under another corporation, then I'm doing photography and I may or may not be submitting depending on revenue into that corporation versus another, just for clarity. So, and if let's say I'm doing, I don't know, let's say it's 25 grand. So I'm under the threshold on the Airbnb side of it, and I'm slightly over the threshold on the photography side of it. On one, I'm paying GST, HST, and on the other, I don't have to register. I just trying to
No, you
differentiate.
would still. So again, one of the areas around that too in the GST legislation is that that $30,000 threshold is for an individual and all associated corporations, partnerships. I can't just set up 10 corporations and have them all under the $30,000 threshold to avoid my GST obligations. And so you'd be considered one associated group for the purposes of the small supplier threshold, and you would have an obligation to collect and remit tax for the Airbnb in that case. And the Airbnb activities and whatever it falls under would be considered a registrant for GST purposes.
Beautiful. Of course, the tax man cometh. I asked that question a little tongue in cheek because it doesn't matter where you go, you're pretty hard pressed to escape that ultimate tax that you got to pay. Now, on the Airbnb side of things, one of the things that we're starting to see right across the country in certain municipalities is the fact that they're saying no short-term rentals. They're shutting it down, and many municipalities are doing that, or segments of a municipality. There's a couple things that go with that. Now I say, okay, well, I can't do long-term rental. It doesn't make sense. I can't cash flow, whatever the story is. I decide to sell. Now, you have pointed out that underneath, you kind of gave us a little bit of a hook that there may be a gotcha in that sale. Can you give us a little more information now that we're on camera?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of property owners think that because they hold property that looks like residential property, and residential property, in particular used residential property, is exempt of GST, they think that their Airbnb properties are also exempt of GST. However, the reality is that residential property is property that is not used, and I'm just going to go into some of the minutiae, but very, very quickly, all or substantially all for short-term accommodations under 60 days, in which the CRA now considers that if I have a property that is primarily being used in short-term rentals, that I effectively don't have residential property, I have something more similar or more akin to a hotel. And so they provide guidelines as to whether or not you are a hotel for GST purposes as opposed to being residential property for GST purposes. Now, a hotel is like any other building, any other commercial building. They are taxable for GST purposes. The trick here, or the caveat here, is that if I'm selling that property and I'm selling that property to an individual who isn't registered for GST, who plans on living in it because they have no intention of using it as an Airbnb, I've effectively sold them commercial property, and I have to collect and remit GST on that, or HST if it's occurring in one of the HST provinces. And a lot of property owners don't realize that when they're selling that property, that they could be on the hook for 13% or more, 15% in the East Coast or 5% on the West of GST, possibly QST if it happened in Quebec, on the sale of that property, because the CRA would consider that property to be commercial in nature and not residential in nature, based on the use of the of being on Airbnb or another short-term accommodation platform.
Okay, so I'm going to go down, and maybe this is the wrong question, but something that popped into my mind. If I buy that Airbnb unit and I buy it new, okay, so I buy it new, I pay tax on that. I pay my GST when I buy that unit, correct?
Yep.
Now, when I sell it, let's say I'm selling it a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, it's now selling to an individual who's going to live in it, and potentially I'm selling it then as a commercial unit still, and that I would then have to collect the tax from that individual of the appropriate tax, 513 or whatever it might be. Did I understand that?
That's absolutely correct. And to be to be fair, we're talking about a situation there when you mentioned of a purchasing new residential property because you pay tax on new residential property.
Mhm.
Even if you purchased used residential property for the purposes of making an Airbnb,
Mhm.
if you've changed the use to a commercial use, which is effectively short-term residential, um, you may be considered, that property may not be considered residential for the purposes of the sale, and you would have to collect tax from the individual, even if they are planning on using it as residential. So even though it looks like a home, it's got all the characteristics of a home, the CRA may consider that you've used that as a hotel or lodging,
Mhm.
and then consider that the sale of that would be taxable.
So interesting. It's a little bit of a button for me because, on a totally different tangent, it sounds like we're paying tax twice. That's how it occurs for me, and I probably shouldn't go down that rabbit hole. But that,
Now,
you know,
you may be. The one thing I would say about that is that if you did purchase a new residential and you were a registrant,
mm,
because you were charging tax on the rent of the property, you'd be entitled to the input tax credit. So you know
ah,
you'd be able to purchase that property, claim the ITCs on it, or because you're a registrant, you might be able to avoid having to pay the tax. That's a different topic altogether. But you would be entitled to the input tax credits on it, and then when you sell it, you'd collect and remit the tax on that. Your hope is that the buyer would pay the tax or agree to pay the tax on that. But often what happens and what we often see is that these sales occur after the sale is done. The seller did not realize that there was a tax collection obligation,
mm.
and there is the legislation does not let you on those properties, especially if it's an individual, to go back and try to collect the tax from them because they're not aware of that happening.
See, that's great. And I mean, that's why we have BDO as trusted partners and experts like you. One of the things that we often share, George Doobie, Tax George, is that we see that, you know, there is so many nuances in the tax world. It doesn't matter, if it's real estate or business or whatever it might be. I mean, BDO has experts across the country. GST George are that you're that experience on, you have some in-depth GST experience, HST experience, and I know more than that. But I mean, that really speaks to it. The simple question that I have, it is not that simple. I want it way more cut and dry, and then there's all these nuances that go with it because, well, then there's this, and what happens if we do this? I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to pay and as little tax as possible. So, anyways, that we're doing legally. So I appreciate the expertise that comes along with that. Now, when you're
Sorry,
aside,
Patrick.
go ahead.
If I can, I was just going to pop in there. One of the things I think a lot of RAIN members and others can get themselves into a little bit of a trap is we take probably because we've done so many, the purchase and sale agreements for granted. But there's a particular box there that says something to the effect of, is the GST and HST inclusive or not of that price? And whether that box is ticked or not can make an enormous difference in terms of what's happening. So again, not to just quickly going through and tick the boxes on the screen or have the realtor do that, but to pay attention to, yes, is GST or not applicable,
Mm,
and ensure that the right questions are asked. Because and GST George can better explain than myself in terms of, at least if we've tried to do the right things and identified whether or not, to the best of our knowledge, an obligation exists. Now, all of a sudden, we've got an ability to have a completely different conversation with Revenue Canada should something go sideways unexpectedly after the fact.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and it's interesting because I tend to like to advise sellers to include the in that clause to say that GST is in addition to the sales price if you can. If you're selling commercial property, and you're selling it to a registrant, there's often no obligation to have to collect that tax for different reasons altogether. But it also protects you in the event that if there is an additional tax consequence, it may not be part of that purchase price, and you might be able to reflect it on an additional, like a supplementary um, appendix or a supplementary agreement.
So I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, I think, and I don't know if this is the right question, but let me, work with me, and I think we'll get to what I'm trying to ask. So, when we're looking at what's happening with municipalities shutting down Airbnb and short-term rentals in that context, and you mentioned commercial. So if I'm going to sell that, and GST aside, if I'm selling it as a commercial property, what are the, I guess we'll call it, the capital gains consequences in that regard? And how does it change, or does it change if I'm holding it in a corporation or not? I'm just looking at, let's say we have a gain, we realize that gain. How does the CRA look at it from that perspective, given that it's going to be maybe classified as a commercial sale?
I'll jump onto the income tax side, but there's a huge GST and HST issue that I'll let George jump onto, because just that deeming process um, creates, again, unexpected surprises. But if the municipality has told me, hey, George, you're not allowed to do a short-term rental with your property, and George decides, okay, I'm not going to try to put a long-term tenant in, I'm just selling the property. So I'm going to have a capital gain, assuming I've sold it for more than I purchased it for, similar to any other scenario. So actually, the short-term rental component won't play an income tax deviation, if you will, in terms of what's going to happen. It's going to be more on GST George's side. He's going to potentially have some awful news for somebody, even where they decide to keep the property for long-term rental use.
Hmm.
Yeah, there could be a change of use for the purposes of GST there if they're deciding to hold on to it after being a short-term rental. If I decide to now use it for long-term tenants or for another use that's an exempt use of that property, like let's say I decide to move in there, there could be a deemed disposition and what's called a self-supply for GST purposes, where I now have to effectively collect the tax and remit the tax on the fair value of that property, um, because it's as if I've sold myself residential property.
Hmm.
Um, One thing I would say, because you do mention the municipalities that may restrict your ability to rent a property um, for short-term use. Now, these are just guidelines from the CRA, but I just want to bring them to an attention. The licensing by a municipality is one of the guidelines the CRA does use when determining if a property is considered commercial. So if I was um, using a property as a short-term accommodation, but I also had a long-term tenant mixed in there, you often see that, especially if it's multi-united, um, and and I have to make the determination as to whether or not this was commercial property at the time of sale or even at the time of having to register for GST. That would be a part of the consideration, whether or not there was a license to use the property as short-term as a short-term facility. I would like to qualify that by saying it's one of the characteristics of a hotel, but it's not all of them. So just because there is no license, that may not impact your requirement to have to collect and remit tax on the sale of that property.
Got it. Now, so as we start to wind down, there's one, I guess what I'd like to know, and maybe can help viewers with, is that, often and most often we hear it time again, when we're going to have a change, something's happening. Okay, we have to sell, we have to collect GST, we hit whatever thresholds. Then we have to go because CRA says, okay, you owe this money, we've reassessed, or, you're selling, well, this is how we deem it. Um, it's always about documentation. It's always about the audit trail that you leave to quantify or qualify your decisions and what you're going back to. Now, is there one, two, three things that you could give our viewers some tips around making sure that whatever documentation is in place or whatever steps are? I maybe too vague a question, but I'm just trying to make sure that people don't show up one day and then you go, well, no, and then you got to get me this and get me that. And, is there something they can do just to be proactive and stay in the loop of creating that audit trail should there be a change?
A few things. I do believe, especially in the case of where a property could be mixed use, short-term use as well as long-term, and you could make the argument that it was always residential. Accurate logging of the tenants, who's been in, who's been out. Airbnb tends to provide a paper trail of that. But if you have some long-term tenants in there for a long time, some kind of agreement in order to identify them would be something that you'd want to keep on the records. Your general transaction keeping, if you were trying to claim, like if this is now commercial property, you're entitled to input tax credits. So you'd want to make sure that any receipts that have GST are kept for, I, you know, the statute barred period is 4 years for GST before you can claim an ITC, but I'd like to keep it at least 6 or more if you can. Tax George, do you have anything else to add to that?
The one thing that I've seen, and I haven't really had to use, but I've had discussions regarding, is more when we're planning the use of the property. Maybe, for example, I'm actually trying to get a long-term tenant in there, or trying to have more of an executive property available where I'm going to rent for, say, 90 days plus. And at times that may not be successful. So in the interim, I put in the short-term rental, but trying to argue with Revenue Canada potentially that my purpose may not be exactly where the numbers show. But if we look back at what my original plans were, and I made reasonable attempts to accomplish those, and ideally over a number of years, I've gotten to where I want to be. I think there's a very different discussion as compared to I don't have any support. I'm just flying by the seat of my pants.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Anything as we wrap up? Anything you want to that we missed talking about? Any points that you want to make before we sign off, gents?
To me, the big thing is, and partly where George and I were talking, I guess it was roughly a month ago, is watching the municipalities that you're investing in, and being able
Mm-hmm.
to chat and look and see how
Yep.
friendly they are, not necessarily specifically to the short-term rentals, but more the tourism industry, for example. Now, there's a couple of contrary examples, no question, where the municipalities went off and, in my opinion, did what they shouldn't have done in terms of the restrictions. But I think some areas are definitely far more friendly. They want the short-term rentals and whatnot to feed the
Yeah.
economy, and not that there's any guarantees that the next election won't completely replace folks, et cetera, et cetera. But it's back to what Rain's been teaching year over year over years: do that due diligence.
You must. Okay, well, listen, gentlemen, the two Georges, GST George, Tax George, appreciate your time. BDO folks, we have BDO as trusted partners because these are the nuances that make a huge difference at tax time. And when you're doing real estate, when you're doing these deals, we want to stay ahead of the game, be proactive, understand what the tax consequences are so that we make great decisions. Two Georges, thanks very much.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.